100 years ago last Sunday, November 11th, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, World War I concluded. They called it the War to End All Wars. See that no one leads you astray, Jesus says. Nation will rise against nation. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. They shook hands, distributed cigars, strutted around the railroad carriages, smiled, and said, "The war to end all wars." Almost immediately after November 11th, 1918, British Field Marshal and Viceroy of India, Archibald Wavell, said, "After the war to end war, they seem to have been in Paris at making the peace to end peace." Nevertheless, some pretty important people seemed to think that World War I was it, that there would never be a war again. They were only partly foolish, thinking mankind had somehow progressed beyond war-making and that war would simply be intolerable in the advanced civilization which was now rushing to take over the world. All our differences would be settled diplomatically. White Europeans, soon to govern the whole world with one all-wise parliament and its all-caring, border-free humanitarian agencies. On the other hand, they had a point. Why would anyone ever want to fight a war on an industrial scale again? In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched a massive offensive intended to push the British back across the Channel and out of Europe, effectively removing one major power from the war. In fact, the British soldiers there were set to be relieved, the very day Germany attacked. These weary British soldiers were easily defeated, and they retreated in haste. The Germans used poison gas to blind them, which elicited from General Haig the famous order, "There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The safety of our homes and the freedom of mankind alike depend upon the conduct of each one of us at this critical moment." Each one of us turned into 82,000 British troops who were killed or wounded, along with 36,000 French killed or wounded. And it always costs more than one Allied soldier to kill one German soldier, who numbered 86,000 killed or wounded. The safety of Allied homes and the ideal of freedom cost 120,000 total killed or wounded. The population of Niagara County today is just over 210,000 people. That many people were slaughtered and maimed in a single military action of World War I. 40 million soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded in the war. Millions of civilians were made into refugees. Entire towns, villages, farmlands, and forests were completely destroyed. Revolution and genocide overtook many populations, and something we take for granted. Commerce and trade came to a halt. Why would anyone ever want to fight a war on an industrial scale again? These are but the beginning of the birth pains, Jesus says. Do not be alarmed. Do not be alarmed. Albert Einstein, as you know, was a mathematical genius, acclaimed the world over for his work and his winsome charisma. He made his name in Berlin. His friend, Walther Rathenau, was assassinated in the streets of Berlin, gunned down by a group of far-right nationalists. Taking counsel from the police, Einstein fled Berlin, hiding in a small town on the northern coast. From hiding, he wrote his sister Maya, "Here are brewing economically and politically dark times. so I'm happy to be able to get away from everything for half a year. This is August of 1922, less than 4 years after the conclusion of the war to end war. A year later, Adolf Hitler appeared. The half year for Einstein. He could never go home again. 25 years later, 20 million soldiers were dead, 40 million civilians were dead, 6 million European Jews had been murdered, Japan was smoldering under nuclear radiation, Stalin was busily murdering his own people by the tens of millions and threatening the world with nuclear missiles, Mao Zedong was likewise murdering his own people by the tens of millions, with many millions more to go. As Churchill's daughter Mary Soames heard Stalin himself say, "A single death is a tragedy. Millions of deaths is a statistic." These are but the beginning of the birth pains, Jesus says. Do not be alarmed. Why would anyone want to fight on such a scale ever again? Mark Twain, before World War I, took a look at the coming age, and he wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, in which an East Coast whippersnapper named Hank Morgan falls and bangs his head, waking up surrounded by the near barbarians of 10th century England, 1,000 years ago. Being an engineer by education and trade, old Hank, armed only with basic knowledge of science, bamboozles the king's court into believing that he is a powerful magician. With all that basic scientific knowledge, Hank has King Arthur looking like a genius in the blink of an eye. He even introduces to them the concept of electricity. The money is rolling in, people are prospering, and the kingdom is growing. Modern science and technology for the win. Science and technology, however, could not cope with typical petty jealousies and rivalries. Those overcame all the benefits of science and technology, and the people decided to make war against clever old Hank, the Connecticut Yankee, who had all the smarts and Yankee know-how, but none of the wisdom to understand human nature. In the end, Hank wired up the battlefield with electricity, with the result that all the armor-plated knights charged valiantly to the battle, only to be electrocuted to death. It was a massacre. It was a massacre in a work of fiction, presaging the real-life massacres of the 20th century. Mark Twain wrote that book right here in Elmira, 25 years before World War I. These are but the beginning of the birth pains, Jesus says. Do not be alarmed. The crucifixion of Jesus still stands, standing tall over the history of the world and all our wars. The crucifixion of Jesus still stands, overlooking our wars, our fires in California, our storms on the East Coast, our famines in Africa, our helplessness in the face of persecution all over the world. The crucifixion of Jesus still stands, and we are not alarmed by any of it. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. See that no one leads you astray. This all must take place, but the end is not yet, and the end is not yet because first it is necessary that the gospel be preached to all the nations, and here we are today doing just that. Do not be alarmed. The message of the cross stands tall, overshadowing everything else, even human nature, even the next war to end all wars.